Good morning and welcome to Burford in the Cotswolds, UK. Now, many of you who watch me may notice I'm not in Greece today. That's because I have family in the UK, and whilst most people go to Greece in the summer, my wife and I have chosen to come to the UK instead. And I have a choice, I can either stick with Greek videos and do nothing for 2 months, because I'm here for 2 months, or I can show you some of the places in the UK that I know and enjoy. And here I am in Burford. Burford is about 22 miles, about 30 kilometres from Oxford, and about 30 miles or 40 kilometres from Gloucester. And it's a fantastic example of a medieval Cotswolds town. So let's have a look round, talk a little bit about its history, what makes a Cotswold special, and I hope you enjoy. So Burford, as I said, is a medieval town located here on a hillside running down to the River Windrush in the valley. And it's a typical Cotswolds town. But what are the Cotswolds? Well, the Cotswolds is an area of England west of Oxford, basically between Oxford, Cheltenham and Bath. And it's an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's the largest area of outstanding natural beauty in the country. And Cotswolds actually means sheep hill or something like that, because a cot in Old English was effectively a sheep farm or a sheep enclosure, and wold means hill, so it was sheep enclosure on the hill or something like that. And as you can see in front of me, the Cotswolds are basically hilly pasture, and it's unusual in the UK because you don't normally get hilly pasture like this in the UK, and it's down actually to the stone that you see all these buildings built from. This is Cotswold's yellow limestone, and it runs as a seam under the Cotswolds, and the nature of the stone makes the land above it perfect for grass pasture and sheep. And the Cotswolds ultimately were built on the wool trade and sheep. But anyway, back to Burford. So here we have Burford, which is actually a small town. There are only about 1,500 permanent residents here, but it's hugely popular because of its picturesque nature and its location in the Cotswolds close to Oxford. And you can see the buildings here date back to, in some cases, the early 15th century. But the town of Burford itself is much older. There are references to it from 702 AD indeed. So in 702 AD, there was a synod of the Roman and the early British Church here to decide at that time the dates for Easter, or the way for picking the dates for Easter. And that happened in 702. There were 2 kings here at the time, and England at that time didn't exist as we know it now. Certainly the United Kingdom didn't. England was a number of different hodgepodge kingdoms. So you had Mercia, you had West Sussex, you had Northumbria, and the kings of Mercia and Wessex came here and met with the Church of the Holy Roman Empire and agreed how Easter was going to be picked. That was 702. Then they obviously fell out because in 752 there was a battle of Burford between their sons or grandsons, and the Mercian king lost. His army was put to flight and he was put on a lance. And ever since then this town has grown. So in the Domesday Book of 1100 or thereabouts, this town had 200 people or 200 residents, but by about 1250 it had 1,000 residents. And the reason for that change was that it was granted royal market status. It was allowed to hold a market here, and that had to be granted by the king, and it was in about 1250, and this became a market town in the Cotswolds. And that commercial elevation allowed the town to support a significant number of traders and farmers and other individuals who otherwise would not have been able to make a living here, but the market allowed them to do that and became very important for this town. So we have this beautiful, ancient, but now medieval Cotswolds town, which is picturesque and beautiful. This 15th century building here was known as the Tolsey. It's now a museum, but it was used as a centre for market and trade, and you can see underneath it's open for that. But it's interesting that they have various skins, including sheepskins here, because of course the street next to it here is called Sheep Street, and the whole town was built on the proceeds of sheep and wool and trade. And as I said, this building, which is 15th century, was a result of the Royal Charter granted to allow a market to be held here in Burford, which is really the reason that Burford is the size it is today. It's not huge, Burford, it's 1,500 people, not much larger than it was in the 12th century. But it was only when the market came here that it expanded to that size. As you can see nowadays, it's trade as tourism. It gets over 1 million tourists a year. It's busy. I mean, here I am Friday lunchtime, you can see the traffic's heavy. Don't think that you're going to come here and it's going to be quiet. But the trade here reflects it. It's very expensive shops nowadays. You have antique shops, you have galleries, you have expensive furniture and homeware shops, and of course you have pubs and restaurants, which is very typical of any of the towns in the Cotswolds. And I'll be covering more towns in the Cotswolds, places like Chipping Campden, Chipping Norton, Stow on the Wold. All of these have a big history. But let's go down to the bottom, the River Windrush, and just have a little look at the most famous church here. There are several churches here, as in many towns in the Cotswolds, but there's a very famous church here, one of the 10 most visited churches in the United Kingdom apparently. So I want to go and have a quick look at it, and again just talk about a little bit of its history. I've come down the hill to the River Windrush just to talk briefly about what Burford as a name means, because a burh in Old English or Saxon was a fortified settlement, and a ford is obviously a point at which you cross a river, and that's exactly what Burford was. It was a fortified settlement at a point where you forded the River Windrush, and it would have been here probably at this bridge. You can see it's damaged now, obviously someone's hit it or something, unfortunately. Beautiful old Cotswolds bridge. You get a very good look here at the Cotswolds yellow limestone, and the River Windrush, not huge. But there was a settlement down here by this river bridge, the Burford, and then gradually, particularly in Elizabethan times, the 15th century onwards, it spread up the hill and took on the size and the scale that we see now. Obviously, as I mentioned, the granting of the market charter in about 1250 made a big difference to that. But there was a church built here. There were several churches built here, but one of the original churches built here was the church down here, which is known as St. John the Baptist. And this dates from about 1125, I believe, the original Norman part of this church, but it's been subsequently added to considerably, and it's known as a wall church, and as I said, it's very, very popular. One of the 10 most visited churches in England apparently. And what do I mean by a wool church? Well, as I said, the Cotswolds was an ideal area for sheep farming and became incredibly rich off the good quality wool that was produced here and exported to the continent. In medieval times, the Cotswolds area would have been known throughout Europe for its wool, and at that time, rather than spend the money on the population and improving the lot of the population, they built churches, and they gave the money to the church, which is common of course, and they took what was a simple Norman church and they expanded it considerably. Now, as with most large churches, I don't believe that this church was the first religious building on here. I actually think it goes back certainly to Roman and probably beyond that to pagan times. There is a stone in this church, and we can go, no we can't go in, maybe we can. There is a stone in this church which is a pagan stone which was found on this site and dates to about 100 AD, but I'm certain that there was probably an early Roman church here on the site of what was probably a pagan ritualistic site down by the Burford. Before we enter this fantastic church, and I can see why it's so popular, one of the 10 most visited in England, I just wanted to correct a date. This church as we see it now, the Norman church at the centre anyway, was built in 1175, not 1125. But as we shall see when we go inside, there are elements which are probably Saxon and considerably older. So the church is open, and I'm going to keep my voice down. I always do when I come into these religious places. But as I said, the origins of this church were certainly far beyond the Norman elements which still exist here. You can see the Norman arches here, but it's a pretty large church. And I'm just wondering where the pagan stone is. I'll see if I can find it. A very kind lady has helped me find this pagan stone. It's actually located up in the ceiling in this tower right near the roof, and you can see it there, the figures dancing, pre-Christian, about 100 AD. And this tower itself is probably predates most of the church, possibly Saxon, which would perhaps put it back to 700 AD, when of course there was the Battle of Burford and the Synod of Burford here, and built into what became a Norman church. And then subsequently, in the 15th century in particular, with the wool trade and the success of the wool trade, became a wool church. And you can see here, for example, above this window, how they've modified the wall to take the roof from being a pitched roof to a flat roof. And this church is very complicated. Perhaps most of it is not as old as it seems to be, but there are elements such as I said, this tower here, and you can see where the old roof trusses would have been, which is very ancient indeed, and perhaps overlooked as a result. This little doorway here in this arch is almost certainly Saxon. Moving forward in time, of course, this church has more modern history. The Cotswolds was a big part of the English Civil War from about 1642 to 1649. And in 1649, there was a very sad history here, actually. The New Model Army soldiers stationed in Banbury revolted against paying conditions, and 350 of them were subsequently captured by the New Model Army and brought here to this church, where they were imprisoned. And the next day, the majority of them were herded up onto the roof to watch as their 3 leaders were executed in the churchyard below them. Subsequently, they decided that perhaps paying conditions weren't quite as bad and rejoined the New Model Army of Thomas Cromwell. So there is a lot of history in this one building, from that pagan stone that we've seen, the Saxon tower, the modification of the wall here at the end, and the imprisonment of Civil War soldiers. So as well as the main street here in Burford, which is obviously the main location for commercial activities, pubs, etc., you do have numerous side streets that you can also branch off into and visit. And I would suggest just walking around here for an hour, 2 hours. If you want to get here, it's not that easy actually. You really need a car. You can use public transport. There are buses that come here, but I would suggest either you take an organised tour, a coach tour, and I have seen a couple of them when I've been here, or you have a car. There is no train station here, which actually limited the development of this place, and it's probably a good thing. It wouldn't look as beautiful as it does today if there had been a train station here or a train line running through, and that goes for the whole of the Cotswolds really. There are not many train lines in the Cotswolds. Do not think that you can use the trains to explore the Cotswolds. You either need an organised tour, or ideally get your own car and drive around, because there's nothing like exploring these places. So there is one other building of note here in Burford, and it's next to the primary school here. But it's not the primary school, it's this building in front of us with rather ominous signs outside saying don't park and no photography and so on. This is Burford Priory, and it was originally an Augustinian hospital on this site, but then rebuilt in the 1500s during the Elizabethan period, and it's changed hands numerous times since then. It's currently owned by Elizabeth Maxwell, who is the sister of Ghislaine Maxwell of Epstein fame and currently incarcerated in the US. Obviously you can't really see much, but it's the home of one of the Maxwell sisters, and therefore has a certain infamy attached to it, I think, given the exploits of her father, who was a newspaper baron here in the UK and fell off a boat and drowned in rather suspicious circumstances about 25 years ago, and subsequently has a daughter who's incarcerated in the US, having got in with Mr. Maxwell, with Mr. Epstein. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my little look at Burford. As you can see, the weather's fantastic. Although the UK is meant to be wet most of the time and cold, this weekend it's going to be 30 degrees. So, you know, although I'm not in Greece right now, I may as well be. It's fantastic. Please watch some of my other videos. I do plan now to mix up my videos between English and Greek videos, so I hope you enjoy them. And I hope some of the places that I now visit in the UK are of interest to you. Thank you very much.